"You don't understand, Samuel. You're not human anymore. You're a vessel, a ship for something far greater than any of us. Watch what will be born from you." Samuel felt his chest throb as if something inside was trying to break free. He struggled to stand, but his body wouldn't respond. Blood began to trickle from his eyes, ears, and even his pores. From the corner of his eye he saw them, creatures moving closer, their forms shifting like mist wrapping around him. They whispered incomprehensible words, but each one felt like a wound tearing through his mind. "No." Samuel mustered all his strength, reaching for the axe lying nearby. His hands trembled as he lifted it, locking eyes with the cloaked figure standing before him. The man froze, seemingly startled by Samuel's defiance. "You cannot fight them," the man said, his voice firm and heavy with certainty. But Samuel roared in defiance. With a swift, desperate swing, he brought the axe down on the glowing symbol carved into the floor. The blade struck the center of the circle, and the red light instantly turned pitch black. A deafening explosion rocked the room. Red light clashed violently with shadows, plunging the space into chaos. Samuel was thrown backward, slamming hard against the wall. When he opened his eyes, the room had changed. The candles had extinguished, and the glowing symbols on the floor had become lifeless etchings. The cloaked man and his creatures were gone, but the air was still thick and oppressive, charged with an unseen energy. Samuel staggered to his feet, pain coursing through his body. He didn't fully understand what he had done, but he knew he had stopped the ritual, at least for now. As he stepped out of the warehouse, he realized Blackridge wasn't finished with him yet. The sky above the village was an ominous dark red, swirling like blood. In the distance, he heard the church bell tolling, its sound distorted and unnatural. It wasn't a call to prayer, it was a warning, a reminder that the cycle wasn't truly broken and that Samuel's battle was far from over. Inside him, something stirred. Something alive. Something he couldn't stop. Each step away from the warehouse felt heavier, the night air cold and dense, nearly choking him. The once familiar village now looked alien. Shadows clung to the corners of houses, and cracked windows stared back like hollow eyes. The doors hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. And then came the whispers. "Samuel." He gritted his teeth, trying to shut them out, but the voices grew louder. Sometimes, they sounded like his mother. Other times, like his father, or the friends he'd lost long ago. By the time he reached the church, Samuel was trembling. The heavy wooden doors, once sealed tightly, now stood wide open, as if beckoning him inside. From within, a familiar crimson glow pulsed, just like in the basement of the warehouse. Taking a deep breath, Samuel stepped inside. The interior of the church was far more nightmarish than he'd imagined. The walls were lined with the same glowing, shifting symbols he'd seen before, but now they seemed alive, veins of red light coursing through them like blood. The bell above the tower continued to ring, though no mechanism was visible to move it. At the center of the room stood a massive black stone altar surrounded by candles burning with an eerie purple flame. Upon the altar lay the lifeless body of a child, its chest torn open but its lifeless eyes staring directly at Samuel. Bile rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down, knowing the body wasn't there by accident. "I knew you would come." The voice came from behind the altar. The cloaked man emerged again, but this time he was alone. No shadowy creatures followed him. Slowly, he stepped forward, revealing his face for the first time. Samuel's blood ran cold. The man's face was his own. But it wasn't. The flesh was mangled, torn as though by claws, and the eyes burned with a hatred so deep it chilled Samuel to his core. What is this?" Samuel gasped, stumbling backward. The man smiled, a cruel, twisted grin. "I am your shadow. I am who you truly are. Everything you've tried to hide, everything you've denied, I'm here to show you." Samuel gripped his axe tighter, his knuckles white. "Shut up." The man chuckled. "You've always been a part of this, Samuel. The moment you stepped foot in Blackridge, your fate was sealed. You are the final sacrifice, the key to opening the gate." He gestured toward the altar. Your blood will complete the cycle. And with it, they will rise again. Samuel didn't wait. With a guttural scream, he charged at the man, swinging the axe with all his might. But before the blade could connect, the man dissolved into mist, vanishing. You're wasting your time, the voice echoed from every corner. You're not fighting them, Samuel. You're fighting yourself. Pain ripped through Samuel's chest. He collapsed to the floor, clutching at his torso as something inside him began to writhe and claw its way out. Blood poured from his mouth and nose, and his vision blurred. But still he fought, digging his fingers into the floor to keep himself grounded. Above him, the bell tolled louder, its rhythm pounding in his skull. The red light intensified, the walls cracking as something black and viscous oozed from the fissures, writhing like a living thing. Accept it, the man's voice whispered again, softer this time. Accept your fate. Accept yourself. With shaking hands, Samuel raised his axe one last time. He didn't know if it would work, but he wasn't about to surrender. Gathering every ounce of strength he had left, he hurled the axe toward the bell above. The blade struck true, shattering the bell into countless shards. The final toll echoed like a scream, reverberating through the church as the entire structure began to collapse. And then, there was darkness. When Samuel opened his eyes, he was back in the middle of Blackridge village. But the village wasn't the same. The houses lay in ruins, the streets were choked with thick black fog, and above, a colossal shadow loomed, watching everything. Samuel tried to stand, but his body felt impossibly heavy. He glanced at his hands, only to find they no longer resembled human skin. What he saw was alien, unrecognizable, no longer his own. He heard whispers around him, louder than before. For the first time, he could understand the words. We've been waiting for you, Samuel. Your time has come. Samuel screamed, but the sound that tore from his throat was no longer human. His scream echoed through the desolation of Blackridge, but no answer came, only the whispers growing louder from the darkness. The black fog that cloaked the ground slithered like a living thing, wrapping itself around his feet. His body still felt weighed down, but more than that, he felt estranged from himself. With trembling hands, he lifted his arm. His skin, once warm and human, was now dark and cracked, with glowing red lines running through it. Pulsing black veins rippled just beneath the surface, as if something within was trying to break free. His fingers, once steady, had elongated into claws tipped with razor-sharp nails. No, no, he whispered, his voice raspy and distorted, like two voices speaking at once. Suddenly, the fog in front of him began to shift, forming faint silhouettes. They moved closer, growing clearer with every step, the missing villagers. But they were no longer human. Their faces were void of emotion, their eyes empty black pits, their bodies covered in wounds that oozed a thick, dark fluid. They moved like marionettes, their heads lolling unnaturally, but their mouths moved in unison, murmuring whispers that shattered the silence. The herald has arrived. The herald has arrived. The herald will open the gate. Samuel stumbled backward, clutching his head in desperation. I'm not your herald. I'm not your anything, he shouted, his distorted voice cracking, but the creatures kept advancing. One of them, an old woman with half her skull exposed, stepped forward and pointed a skeletal finger at him. You belong to them. You are the key. Samuel stared at her, his hand gripping the axe now fused to his arm. It trembled in his grasp. I don't want this. I just want to get out of here. The old woman cackled, her laughter dry and brittle, like breaking bones. There's no escape from Blackridge. You are part of the cycle now, and soon you will lead them. Samuel screamed again, but this time, he felt something deeper take hold. His voice grew louder, darker, reverberating through the air, as the whispers in his mind surged, an unstoppable tide of voices. Open the gate. Free them. Above the village, the sky began to churn. A swirling red vortex gathered, like a storm converging on a single point. From the fog came the sound of immense, deliberate footsteps, shaking the ground. Samuel turned, and in the distance, he saw it, the giant figure emerging from the direction of the church. It was the entity he had seen earlier, a colossal shadow with a twisted body and a face like ancient stone carvings from forgotten catacombs. Symbols etched into its form glowed with an ominous red light. The creature spoke, its voice bypassing Samuel's ears and driving straight into his mind. "Herald, the time has come. Find the final altar. Fulfill your purpose." Samuel shook his head violently, resisting the command. "I'm not your puppet. I won't open anything." The entity remained still, but the ground beneath Samuel began to quake. From the earth, thin black hands shot out, clawing at his legs, trying to drag him down. "You have no choice," the entity said. "Your will is irrelevant. You are bound to us." With every ounce of strength he could muster, Samuel swung his axe at the hands, severing them one by one. But for every hand he cut, more emerged, clutching him tighter. "You won't take me," he shouted, though he knew it was a lie. He could feel control slipping away, the whispers in his mind growing more commanding, and his body succumbing to an overwhelming will. In desperation, he turned to the monstrous villagers surrounding him. "If I'm the key, then I can destroy the key. If I die, this ends, doesn't it?" The villagers paused, silent for the first time, but the giant spoke again, its tone menacing. "Your death will only hasten their release. They are within you. Through your blood, they will be free." Samuel froze. He looked at his fractured, glowing hands, at the axe that felt like an extension of himself, and at the churning, apocalyptic sky above. There was only one option: to find the final altar and destroy it before the creatures could use it to open the gate. "Then I'll end this my way," he muttered. Samuel began to run, or tried to. Each step felt like wading through quicksand, his body racked with waves of pain and the relentless voices in his mind. Behind him, the villagers followed, moving like shadows he couldn't escape. He knew where he had to go. The vortex in the sky marked the altar's location at the village center, in the ruins of the town hall. As he neared it, the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing something horrifying: human heads, screaming as they tried to claw their way out of the darkness below. Samuel couldn't afford fear. He kept moving, kicking, slashing, and pushing through whatever tried to stop him. When he finally reached the altar, he froze. It was massive, carved from black stone and etched with glowing red symbols. At its center was an ancient dagger, its blade shimmering with an eerie light. He knew what he had to do. "The dagger will end it all," whispered the voices in his mind. But Samuel didn't trust them. He raised his axe high, prepared to smash the altar to pieces. Before he could strike, his body froze. Something inside him seized control, forcing his arm down. He screamed, fighting against it, but his limbs no longer obeyed him. For the first time, he watched helplessly as his own hand moved without his will, grasping the dagger and pulling it from the altar. "The gate has been opened." The voice boomed as the ground shook violently. From within the altar, a blinding red light erupted, illuminating the ruined village. And from the light, something began to emerge. Something humanity was never meant to see. The sound filled the air as the ground trembled, and from the altar, a blinding red light erupted, illuminating the devastated village. From within that light, something began to rise, something no human was ever meant to see. The explosion of red light from the altar was blinding, consuming the entire village of Blackridge in a single agonizing flash. Samuel, clutching the ancient dagger in a hand no longer fully his own, could do nothing but watch. His body was frozen, moving under a will that wasn't his. From within the altar, the entity emerged. It had no fixed form. Shadows, fire, and blood twisted together into a constantly shifting mass. Samuel's gaze locked onto it, and in an instant, he felt his mind being pulled into a bottomless abyss of darkness. In that darkness he heard voices, not one but thousands, speaking a language he couldn't understand, yet each word felt like it was tearing his mind apart. "Samuel, You have fulfilled your purpose. The entity spoke directly to him, its voice unlike anything human, a cacophony of wails, laughter, and whispers. I never wanted this. Samuel screamed, his voice echoing in the void surrounding him. There is no desire here, only will. You are the vessel, the gateway to my return. Now, I will repay the world that forgot me. When Samuel regained awareness, he found himself standing in the center of the village. The altar before him had melted into a pool of black liquid, a gaping maw in the earth. From the void within, creatures began to emerge, small figures resembling infants, but their scaly skin and razor-sharp teeth were far from human. They scuttled with unnatural speed, spreading out in every direction. Above, the swirling red vortex in the sky was fully open, and from within, something larger began to descend. The shadowy giant that loomed above the church earlier now took on a clearer form, a humanoid body with a face that was nothing but a gaping void, oozing black ichor. The remaining villagers, or what little was left of them, began to scream in unison. Their bodies collapsed one by one, merging with the earth, becoming part of the spreading destruction. Samuel fought against the control that bound him. His trembling hand gripped the axe at his side, even as the voices in his head commanded him to surrender. No, he roared. I won't let this happen. With every ounce of strength left in him, Samuel raised the axe and swung it down on his own hand, the one clutching the ancient dagger. Black blood sprayed out, and pain like fire coursed through his entire body. The dagger fell to the ground, its glow dimming. The creatures reacted immediately. The scuttling shadows let out a collective wail, and the towering entity in the sky turned its eyeless gaze toward Samuel. You cannot stop us, the voice spoke again, now tinged with anger and urgency. But Samuel wasn't listening. He grabbed the dagger with his uninjured hand, clutching it tightly even as blood continued to pour. He knew what had to be done. He couldn't destroy the entities, but he could close the gate, and there was only one way to do it. With staggering steps, he approached the altar, now a massive chasm in the ground. Within, he saw the roiling darkness, something far more immense than the creatures that had already emerged, waiting to break free. If I have to die here, then I'll take all of you with me, he muttered. He raised the dagger high, aiming it at his own chest. The creatures screamed as one, realizing what he intended to do. The colossal shadow in the sky descended with impossible speed, desperate to stop him. But Samuel didn't give it the chance. With one swift motion, he plunged the dagger into his own chest. Black and red blood erupted from his body, but it wasn't ordinary blood, it was light. Blazing light poured into the earth, spreading into the altar's depths. The creatures shrieked as the light consumed them, their forms igniting and disintegrating. The massive shadow let out a deafening roar before its body shattered into countless fragments, swallowed by the closing vortex in the sky. Samuel felt his body dissolving, every nerve alight with searing pain. But he knew this was the end. As the altar's void sealed shut and the vortex vanished, Blackridge fell into a deadly silence. Samuel opened his eyes. He was no longer in Blackridge. He stood in a place with no shape, a void without color or sound. From the distance, he heard the voice again, but now it was calmer, almost reverent. You made your choice. You sacrificed everything. But they will return. The cycle never ends. Samuel didn't respond. He stood alone in the emptiness, knowing his fight had only delayed the inevitable. And in that void, Samuel disappeared. The village of Blackridge became nothing more than ruins, yet its malevolent energy lingered, waiting for the next cycle to begin. Time passed. One morning, the sun rose slowly over Blackridge, but its light brought no warmth. The village lay in utter ruin, homes reduced to ash, streets littered with debris, and the air still thick with the stench of death. Yet the village wasn't completely abandoned. From the wreckage, a group of explorers tread cautiously, led by a man named Jonas, an archaeologist drawn by the legends of this cursed place. With his small team, Jonas sought to uncover the truth about what had happened in Blackridge. What is this? A woman in his team asked, picking up a shard of black stone from the ground. It was cold to the touch, yet pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. Jonas shook his head. This isn't like anything I've ever seen. They pressed on, uncovering more anomalies, strange markings in the earth, half-human remains, and the collapsed remnants of a massive altar now sunken into a black pit at the village's center. What caught their attention the most was an ancient dagger lying on the ground, faintly glowing with a dim, red hue. "Jonas, take a look at this," one of his team members said, pointing toward the dagger. Jonas stepped closer, his eyes widening. The carvings on the blade were eerily similar to symbols he had seen in ancient texts describing rituals to summon beings from another world. "This can't be," he muttered. "This is part of the Blackridge legend. This weapon, it shouldn't exist here." As Jonas reached out to pick up the dagger, one of his team members, a young man named Eli, grabbed his arm. "Jonas, I don't think we should touch that," Eli said, his voice trembling. "Something about this place feels wrong." Jonas ignored the warning. "We're here to find answers, Eli. If we're too afraid to touch anything, we'll never uncover the truth." He carefully picked up the dagger, but the moment his hand made contact, something strange happened. The air around them grew heavy, and whispers echoed from every direction. The rest of the team became visibly uneasy, their eyes darting around in panic. "Jonas, we need to leave now," said a woman holding a piece of broken stone. Jonas tried to suppress the fear creeping into his chest. He placed the dagger into his bag and said firmly, "We're not leaving until we figure out what's really going on here." As they continued their exploration, the atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling. A thin mist began to roll in, despite the sun still shining overhead. The whispers grew louder, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the ruins. "Is it the wind?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer wasn't that simple. When they reached the center of the village, where a black altar pit lay, Jonas froze. The pit no longer glowed, but its presence was menacing. The ground around it seemed to pulse, like the beat of a heart. Jonas stepped closer, but the ground beneath him suddenly cracked, and he fell. He tumbled several feet before stopping at the edge of the massive pit. "Jonas!" Eli rushed over, but as he reached to help Jonas to his feet, something cold touched his leg. Looking down, Eli saw a skeletal black hand gripping his ankle. The creature's hollow, horrifying eyes stared back at him. Eli screamed and tried to break free, but more hands emerged from the earth, pulling him toward the pit. Jonas scrambled to help, but when his hand, holding the dagger, made contact with Eli, something shifted. The dagger in Jonas's grasp began to heat up, and the symbols on the blade glowed fiercely. In an instant, the creatures dragging Eli retreated, disappearing back into the ground. Gasping for air, Eli trembled. What the hell just happened? Jonas stared at the dagger, his expression a mix of fascination and dread. "I don't know, but this is more than just an artifact." The woman in their group, now visibly terrified, said, "We have to leave. This place doesn't want us here." But Jonas wasn't listening. Instead, he stepped closer to the pit, peering into its depths. In the darkness, he saw something. A massive shadow swirling, shifting as though it were alive and breathing. Jonas couldn't look away, drawn in by its sheer presence. "Jonas!" Eli shouted, grabbing his arm to pull him back. Before Eli could reach him, a voice erupted from the pit, a voice that couldn't belong to anything human. It was deep, resonant, and bone-chilling. "You have awakened us, and the cycle shall begin again." Jonas's team fled the village, abandoning everything except the dagger still clutched in Jonas's hand. They returned to the city with a story no one would believe. But from that day forward, they were haunted by the same nightmare, a massive shadow moving in the darkness, whispers calling them back to Blackridge, and that voice, always that voice, warning that their time was running out. Elsewhere, in the abandoned altar pit, something began to stir. Something ancient, powerful, and ravenous for the world above. The cycle was far from over. Weeks after escaping Blackridge, Jonas and his team's lives had become an unending nightmare. Each night, They woke drenched in sweat, their minds filled with whispers from the void. Each morning, they discovered strange markings on their bodies, symbols identical to those carved into the dagger. Jonas locked himself in his downtown apartment, obsessively studying the dagger, desperate to find answers. But the more he examined it, the more he felt like he wasn't alone. The air in his apartment felt alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Shadows flickered and shifted unnaturally. And the dagger, it throbbed like a beating heart. Jonas knew something was horribly wrong, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. One night, he heard footsteps outside his door. Odd, considering he lived on the top floor of an apartment building. When he opened the door to investigate, the hallway was empty, yet something was off. The walls were slick with a thick, black liquid that dripped slowly. Before Jonas could close the door, an unseen force shoved it back open. He barely had time to react before a dark, shapeless mass dragged him into the hallway's shadows. By morning, his apartment was empty. The only clue was a glowing red symbol etched into the floor, fading slowly. When word of Jonas's disappearance reached Eli, he tried to contact the remaining team members, but no one responded. Fear began to gnaw at him. It was all connected to Blackridge and the cursed dagger. "What do you want from me?" Eli screamed into the night, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. The whispers around him grew louder, almost coherent. Then a voice, familiar and unmistakable, spoke clearly, the same voice from the Blackridge pit. "Bring us back. Open the way. The gate is not yet sealed." Eli tried to get rid of the dagger, throwing it into a river in the dead of night. But by the next morning, it had inexplicably returned to his desk, spotless and gleaming. 3 nights after Jonas's disappearance, Eli heard a knock at his door. It was soft yet insistent. Gripping the dagger tightly, he opened the door to find Harper, the woman from their team, standing in the doorway. However, something was wrong with Harper. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, and her movements were stiff, like a broken puppet. "Jonas," she said in a flat voice, "you can't run away from them." "What do you mean?" Jonas asked, his body tense. "They're still here," Harper replied, pointing at the knife in Jonas's hand. "We brought them out, and now they'll never leave." Harper smiled, but it was more like a grotesque grimace stretched too wide. Before Jonas could respond, Harper collapsed to the ground, her body dissolving into the same black liquid he had seen back at Blackridge. Jonas knew his time was running out. If he didn't find a way to stop whatever was happening, he would end up like Eli and Harper. Summoning the last bit of courage he had, he decided to return to where it all began, Blackridge. But this time, he wouldn't go alone. He reached out to Dr. Malcolm Reed, an occult expert who had studied similar events in the past. Dr. Reed listened to Jonas's story intently, his face growing pale. "Jonas," he said gravely, "what you brought out of Blackridge wasn't just a knife. You brought the seal that held something in their world. And now, the seal is breaking. What can we do?" Jonas asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "We have to close the gate completely," Reed replied. "And the only way to do that is by sacrificing something, or someone, connected to the seal." Jonas fell silent. He knew exactly who Reed was referring to. The next day, Jonas and Dr. Reed arrived at the abandoned village. Blackridge was darker than ever. A thick black fog shrouded the village, and the ground beneath their feet seemed alive, shifting with every step. At the heart of the village, the altar pit was open again, and horrifying sounds echoed from its depths. "Quick," Reed said, opening an ancient book and beginning to chant a spell to close the gate. "I need time. You have to protect me." Knife in hand, Jonas stood beside Reed, bracing himself for whatever would emerge from the darkness. And then they came. Small, twisted creatures began crawling out of the pit, followed by larger, warped figures with blank faces. Jonas fought them off with the knife, but for every one he killed, 2 more took its place. As Reed neared the end of his incantation, the ground beneath them quaked violently, and the largest entity emerged, the same being Jonas had seen swirling in the sky. The creature advanced toward Reed, its gaping maw wide open, ready to consume him. Jonas had no choice. Summoning every ounce of bravery, he charged forward and plunged the knife into his own chest, just as Samuel had done before. A blinding red light erupted from Jonas's body, spreading across the village. The creatures screamed, their bodies disintegrating in the light. The altar pit began to seal shut, and the massive entity was pulled back into the darkness. Dr. Reed could only watch, his eyes filled with both horror and awe, as Jonas's body disappeared along with the knife, sealing the gate for good. When Reed emerged from Blackridge, the village was eerily silent. No more sounds, no more whispers, only devastation remained. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, a voice still whispered, "We will return." Years after Jonas's sacrifice, the village of Blackridge remained abandoned and desolate. No one dared approach it, not even lost hunters who would rather take the long way around than cross its boundaries. Yet, the legend of the village endured, attracting those who sought answers, or something far darker.